Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Gooey's Dungeon Dive, the podcast where I, Gooey, rank all of the dungeons in the Legend of Zelda series. And this week in Oracle of Seasons, we meet the Pirations, a group of skeletal pirates who are led by their captain, Cap'n. We have to help him find his special bell tarnished in the desert, get it polished so he can come back to his senses and lead his beach boat back out to sea, allowing us access to the graveyard in Holodrum. Within the graveyard rests our next destination, Explorer's Crypt. And I think we're back on board with the shape-based maps, but impressively this time, this dungeon has 3 different floors, and each one is its own scary, maybe skeleton or ghost looking face. So nice job there, making that all work. This fits really well with the setting too, because we are exploring a haunted crypt. Believe it or not. The main gimmick this dungeon is built around sees the return of the Poe sisters. This time there's only 2 though. They haunt this dungeon with a curse that in some room causes the torches to slowly go out, and once they do, you're sent back to the beginning of the dungeon, forced to try again. The trick to moving past is actually finding your way to these unlit torches in the nearby rooms and lighting those, and doing so will cause one of the Poes to appear and you have to do battle with them. Defeating them will cause the curse to be broken in that particular area and progression is able to be made. There's even a final confrontation with the 2 of them as the mini-boss of the dungeon, and fighting them together is actually pretty fun. It's right before the run-up to the final boss. They both have their own unique patterns, and while battling them, they try to blow out the torches in the room, attempting again to send us back to the entrance. So you have to be proactive about keeping those torches lit. So it's a pretty fun, memorable set piece. But beyond that, the dungeon, it's fairly linear once again in terms of like just the order of operations of collecting stuff, lighting the torches, getting the key item and using it. But it does heavily employ backtracking, so just mastering the layout is still a must. The dungeon could maybe come off a bit more confusing than it really is to a new player, especially with how some of the floors are woven together. Actually, with the 3 floors, the dungeon does something pretty clever. It re-employs the trampolines that bounce you up to a higher floor. Now we also have a red one that will bounce you up 2 floors, and this dungeon with its 3 floors is laid out perfectly to kind of take advantage of that, employing puzzles that kind of involve you bouncing up 2 floors, going down 1. Like the basic navigation, it's actually not that tricky, but it does give the dungeon a sense of interconnectedness and also can probably give more new players something to tease their brains over. Speaking of jumping, platforming is heavily used in this dungeon beyond just the trampolines. We see a heavy use of items like the magnetic gloves, now with even more complicated and exciting puzzles and platforming challenges. You also see an upgraded jumping ability as the Rock's Feather is traded up for the Rock's Cape. This allows us to float through the air even further, and it's a lot of fun as it can be used to float and twist around some gaps, and it feels even more wild to use along with the Pegasus seeds, which can get you flying across the screen. Rock's Cape feels especially vital against the dungeon boss. What do you know, another classic Zelda boss, Gleeok. This dude feels hard as heck to me, but I love him. Like the original Gleeok, we had to remove his heads as he shoots fire at us. But if only one is removed in this case, it will almost certainly have time to heal before the other is defeated, starting the process all over again. The trick I found most useful was trying to jump to avoid his attacks while doing spin attacks on his head to do damage to both at once. Even when both of the heads are removed, he goes crazy and into this like skeleton mode, which is appropriate for the dungeon, while stomping around and charging at you. And you have to use the Rock's Cape to avoid the stomping or it will knock you down and leave you vulnerable. I died a lot to this boss, but luckily the warp from the beginning puts you almost outside his room, and it also has some fairies right there, so retrying isn't too hard. And once again, it's extremely satisfying to learn his movements, get better, and eventually defeat him. So, nice to see again. And once again, that leads us to another essence of nature. We've almost collected them all, and this time we get the Seed of Life. Life begins anew when birds carry this, the Seed of Life, to new lands. So again, another memorable dungeon. You know, as we're getting close to the end, I'm seeing we're not getting anything too complicated, but it's kind of giving us kind of memorable gimmicks with some solid still progression and exploration while keeping it fairly more. It's really you kind of weaving in and out of these areas in a more linear fashion especially if you're really paying attention. I don't think you're gonna get too lost. I find myself like I've already played it, so I kind of know it a little bit, and feel like I'm, you know, pretty good at creating that mental map. But yeah, like I said, I think you could get pretty lost if you didn't know what you're doing, or, you know, figuring out, can I get past these torches or not? Having to backtrack if you get sent back too can cause some problems if you're trying to figure out, how do I get from here to this floor? You know, going back and forth between the floors, but they usually give you pretty solid opportunities for backtracking. So yeah, I don't know. I really, again, like this one. It's somewhere. It's still just in the mix with the top dungeons here. Somewhere in with the Ancient Ruins and Dancing Dragon dungeon. I think surprisingly, like, the gimmick of kind of bringing back like the Forest Temple gimmick of the pose was cool and kind of executed uniquely still. And even though there's only the 2 pose, you have kind of 3 encounters with them, and they're all unique. As you know, the 4 pose, you still have 3 unique encounters. So I think that's something worth writing home about. And yeah, it does actually change up the forward progression, I guess, a little bit. Yeah, this and Ancient Ruins really go for kind of memorable, unique gimmicks. I think not just the pose, but I do think the 3-level trampolining and stuff like that actually does give this even more of a unique flavor. Still not enough, I don't think, to burst into the top 10 on my regular list. So even if I go number 1 here, which I don't know if I will for seasons, I can't see it breaking into the top 10, but it's overall, it's really solid. Like, that's kind of how I feel. It's like we've got it down to, we've kind of figured out a good formula for gameplay and they've honed it pretty well here, but it's not totally breaking things. But it's cool to see them coming up with, you know, when you think of the Link's Awakening dungeons, which were a little bit more, I don't know, it was like they didn't ever, these last few have had like more like specific, like not real world, but like, you know, themes they're tying it to, as opposed to like, you know, bottle grottos. You got a lot of bottles shaped like a bottle, or even Catfish's Maw, you know, kind of all over the place, or even Dancing Dragon, you know, just kind of all over. This is like, last dungeon was Indiana Jones. This dungeon is spooky haunted crypt, you know. That's cool. Definitely seen the series kind of hone the thematics, which is cool. And this still has a lot of cool moment to moment platforming and memorable, you know, challenges, gameplay, combat, puzzling. The backtracking can be a bit tedious, but it's not bad. It's a small dungeon. I'm sure some people will be kind of turned off by that. God, I don't know. I think my instinct is to say it's above Dancing Dragon. You know, I'm gonna put it above Ancient Ruins too. I think it does a good job. And again, with the past 2, it goes to show that, like, being more linear doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. People often talk about, you know, the difference between ages and seasons. And I think it's showing here that this is more gameplay focused, combat focused, or whatever you want to say, more action based. I was saying there's a good value to like a mix in complication. I think it would have been nice to see one more kind of trickier dungeon. You know, I guess we'll see. I guess we'll see what happens next week, but I think we've got a solid set of dungeons here. Totally not groundbreaking, nothing that's moving the series forward necessarily. Some new ideas for sure, don't get me wrong, that are worthy for sure, but we haven't broken that top 10, and I'm wondering, I'm not thinking we can, but I guess we'll see next week with the sword and shield maze. So I will see everybody next week. Thanks for watching. Bye.